This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Podcast. Thrilled today to be joined by a regular guest, one of the smartest people I ever get to visit with. We're talking to David Pivnick. David's a partner at McGuireWoods who does litigation, typically either white-collar criminal litigation or big commercial disputes, a lot of it in healthcare, a lot of it for private equity-sponsored companies. David, take a moment and introduce yourself. Then we'll talk about sort of what trends you're watching currently. There's been a huge uptick, it seems, in antitrust cases, but tell us what you're keeping an eye on currently.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Scott. So, as you said, I'm David Pivnick. I'm a partner at McGuireWoods, and my practice is really focused on entirely on litigation, but largely at the intersection of healthcare and private equity issues. A couple areas that are keeping me busy these days and that I've been actively involved in and monitoring are, one, government enforcement, DOJ enforcement priorities, and where it seems like a lot of the enforcement attention and activity has been taking place. So on that front, continuing to see a ton of activity relating to the opioid epidemic. That has been something we've talked about before and continues to be sort of a hot button issue, and we're seeing a lot of different theories being explored by DOJ on that front, whether it's looking at issues in the lab space and the use of urine drug testing or other testing, whether it's looking at sales of prescription pads or sort of more nefarious conduct in terms of prescriptions, or where it's issues that are more subtle types of prescription abuse, frequent refills, additional visits being charged for, making patients come in to get their prescriptions or doing it unnecessarily. Things of that nature is a big issue. Also seeing a lot of activity in home health and hospice, and I've seen a little bit of additional activity in things that have sort of, I would say, arisen out of or adjacent to the pandemic, not directly involving COVID funds, but rather things like telehealth issues or other abuses of changes in the modality of care that arose from the pandemic, and where the government is sort of digging in to how that care was provided. And then commercially, I'm seeing a lot more activity, and I've seen this, both on the plaintiff side representing clients, but also on the defense side in terms of indemnification disputes, after a transaction closes, and seeing a lot more activity on that front, which could be a function of a heightened enforcement and compliance environment where third-party claims are becoming more common, but also a lot of these issues, coming up post-closing where the buyer or the seller feels aggrieved as to how some portion of the transaction played out.
Thank you. So a busy time in terms of litigation. The opioid settlement continues, different opioid settlements continue to roil different parties. I know Rite Aid recently filed for bankruptcy coming out of opioid issues and challenges. The telehealth universe is sort of a fascinating work in progress as government and providers figured out how to work with it and regulate it and so forth. There's been some huge abuse cases in the telehealth area, but then a lot of positives with telehealth too. What else are you watching closely currently, David?
I'm also interested in what's going to take place with changes in the non-compete environment. We represent a lot of physician groups, but also a lot of platforms that employ a lot of physicians. And I think it'll be interesting to see changes in the enforceability of non-competes. And we're certainly trying to be, conscientious and deliberate in how we structure non-competes for our clients right now, to maximize the probability that they'll be enforceable. But I think that's going to be an area where changes in the law down the road are going to continue to shape what can be restrained and what the non-competes look like, and then also how enforceable they are.
Thank you. And it does seem like all of a sudden you've got a very activated Department of Justice and FTC in terms of these kinds of issues. The FTC on non-compete, the Department of Justice, I think yesterday announced that they're suing Amazon for monopolistic practices, not necessarily particularly related to healthcare, but it does seem like all of a sudden you've got an attitude coming out of the government that they're trying to go after some either big businesses or some traditional business practices. And And that's a fascinating thing to watch, especially as we move towards an election year as well.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of activity will continue, and some of it might be a function of politics and, more active DOJ. I think some of it, frankly, is also just, not to sound trite, but something of a sign of the times where, the risk of monopolies and the impact that they have on day-to-day Americans' lives, or not just Americans, but in this context, Americans' lives, I think makes them a more notable target, whether or not there's necessarily wrongdoing. And that's, not opining on the merits so much as just, where there are large companies and they're engaged in these, in big business, and there are a lot of monopolies in a lot of space. I always phrase that. There's a lot of companies that are growing towards that kind of power. I think there's going to be a lot more inquiry.
No, I think that's right. And we're constantly talking about sort of healthcare has a power imbalance problem, but you're also, which is a different issue, a different subject entirely, and complicated subject between payers and providers and so forth. The other thing that's fascinating is all of a sudden you've got big strikes again, whether it was the Screen Actors Guild or it's potentially 75,000 nurses at Kaiser striking, the UAW strikes. I mean, all of a sudden you've also got litigation and challenges around this, and you've got this fascinating situation where Biden and Trump trying to figure out how to line up with union sympathizers, but at the same time not have this tiff with the electric vehicle makers that aren't having the same strike problems right now. I mean, what a mess it all seems to be in terms of conflict in America.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's lots of political dynamics that impact day-to-day life, and I think it spills over into business as well, and some of these enforcement actions as well. And there are certainly popular targets, rightly or wrongly, from a corporate standpoint on different sides of the aisle. And I think, some of the dynamics, ranging down to things like the disputes between DeSantis and Disney in Florida show that the intersection of politics and business, I think, is becoming increasingly close cut and causing a lot more controversy and litigation.
Right. And it seems like at some point, both Ron DeSantis and Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, have decided that they're close to having enough of this dispute, that it's bad for everybody. It certainly hasn't helped DeSantis's presidential prospects, but what a mess, and not to use an improper phrase, but what a cluster F as well. What a mess. In any event, David, I want to thank you. It's always interesting visiting with you, one of the smartest people I get to visit with. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Becker Private Equity Podcast. Again, to our listeners, anybody who has an idea on guest ideas, topics, 773-766-5322. We're always looking for great ideas. David, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Scott.